This week, Paul and I interview Jamie Duncan, the cloud guy at Red Hat Public Sector. In the news, dozens of companies leaked sensitive data thanks to misconfigured Box accounts. GoDaddy, Apple, and Google misissue over 1 million certificates, but there's really no reason to panic. And Beto O'Rourke was a secret member of the Cult of the Dead Cow. Who knew? Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 54, our 55th episode of Application Security Weekly. I'm, of course, your host, Keith Hoodlett, and I'm excited to be joined once again by my illustrious co-host, Paul Asadorian.
Hey, thanks, Paul. Keith. Good to be here.
Good to have you here, as always. Paul, how's it going? How was your weekend? I know it's starting to warm up around here now that it's getting to be spring. As you can see, the light is shining onto one side of my face. I look a little angelic or, weird.
It's all good. It's all good. Had a good weekend celebrating St. Patrick's Day and still have my green on, apparently.
I was going to say, still wearing your green. Very good. Top of the afternoon to you, I guess, in this case. So a couple of quick announcements before we get into the interview with Jamie. First, join us April 1st to the 3rd at Disney's Contemporary Resort for InfoSec World 2019, where you can connect and network with like-minded individuals in search of actionable information. Visit infosecworld.misty, that's MISTI.com, and use the registration code OS19-SecWeek for 15% off the main conference or World Pass. If you're interested in booking an interview or briefing with Security Weekly, please go to securityweekly.com/conference request, that's one word, to submit your request. One other quick announcement, and I'm sure this will probably make a few listeners a little bit sad, but next week will actually be my last week as the main host of Application Security Weekly. I have been very fortunate to have some expansion of my responsibilities with my current employer, and I'm actually going to be working on a couple of projects and probably even starting up a blog to talk a little bit about that in the coming weeks and months. So you can always reach me, of course, on Twitter at @andmyhacks. That's HACKS. More than happy to talk further. But yeah, it's been so much fun, Paul, being part of this show and seeing it grow over the last year and several months. It's been kind of unreal. So I'm going to miss it.
We're going to miss you, Keith. That's all I got to say. And it's a bittersweet ending, like I want you still here as a host, but I know the things that you're moving on to are really awesome as well. So make sure you keep us up to date on those and come back on the show periodically as your schedule allows and fill us in.
You bet.
That's right.
Yeah.
Any show.
I may just show up randomly someday and, suddenly you hear my voice again in the announcement section. You're like, wait a minute, what? That's Keith. So,
absolutely. Yeah, dude, I'm happy for you.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much.
Keith was you're not mad? I'm like, dude, I've worked a full-time job and done this on the side, dude. Like, if there's anyone that understands, it's me, dude. Like, it's totally.
Yeah. And admittedly, I really appreciate that, Paul. When I, sent that forward, I was like, this is either going to really be terrible or like Paul's going to be, totally good with it. And when you're like, no, I totally get it. I was like,
totally get it. Yeah.
So with that, we're going to jump right into our interview with Jamie Duncan. Jamie is a recovering history major who has been at Red Hat for over 7 years. Beginning with his role as a technical account manager, his focus has increasingly centered on the operations-oriented features of OpenShift, including the May 2018 publication of OpenShift In Action by Manning Publishing. Jamie has had this discussion with customers and, of course, OpenShift advocates and technology fans on multiple continents to date. The fundamental knowledge of how containers work, helps people treat containers like a revolutionary technology that they are, using them strategically to solve their challenges. And when not knee-deep in OpenShift, Jamie's in hobby farming and an F1 racing fan. Jamie Duncan, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks. Good to meet everyone. How is everyone doing today?
We're doing great. And this is also proof that trolling me on Twitter could land you a spot on the show, which I think is awesome.
Right.
It started, I was telling before the show, like people take pictures during the presentation, which I like. It means they're engaged with the content at least enough to take a picture, but then they put it on social media, and you can take a lot out of context if someone just were to snap a picture of me in one of my slides, right? Which I don't know if I'm going to change how I write my slides, but Jamie, rightfully so, called me out and said, what do you mean the Docker documentation is terrible and you're struggling? And I'm like, well, the presentation explained all that and how it has gotten better, but I could see where, context. Yeah. And then I looked into Jamie's background. I'm like, you'd make a great guest for the show. Like you're, eyeballs deep in all this stuff. I
don't know that I can agree with that second part, but the first part, awesome. Yeah,
sure.
I am a very, very happy is the wrong word, but certainly a part-time Twitter troll in the container space. I unfortunately will even go after my own team occasionally. I work at Red Hat, and the OpenShift Twitter feed put something out there a few weeks ago. The one of the things that really just drives me nuts is that idea of no ops.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Oh my God! I mean, I'm an old sysadmin, so I can't. There is no such thing as no ops. And one of the luminaries, one of the biggest IT celebrities in the Kubernetes world, Clayton Coleman, wrote up some article, and I couldn't even bring myself to read anything beyond the introductory paragraph of the article. So I don't know if he was using it as like a counterpoint or something. I'm taking it out of context, much like your slide. But I was like, no, there's, it's like, what does no ops mean to you? And I responded back, I was like, it means nothing because it can't exist. To the OpenShift Twitter feed. So I'm very, unfortunately, my trolling will also bite the hand that feeds me on occasion.
And so I believe, interestingly, as Paul and I were talking about this before, the original conversation around all of this was actually, I think, related to Docker documentation. And when Paul said that, I was like, Docker documentation is actually really good. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
So
no, back when I started, so my presentation was about my journey of taking a small Python app and putting it inside of Docker containers and continuing that journey over the years. So when I first started taking my Python application and putting it into Docker, when I was reading the Docker documentation is very good, right? It points out all of the different things you might want to include in your recipe, but doesn't give you the full recipe necessarily. And so when you go find back then, the recipes, most of it was people who were doing it for their dev box, like just as a test or, trying to learn it. And it wasn't a production example. And that was basically my beef. And now it has gotten a little better, I would say, as more of the folks that are using it in production are now publicizing their documentation, and it is much better.
Yeah,
maybe
there's
not,
still an awful lot of containers out there running as UID 0.
Yeah.
Way too many containers out there running as UID 0. But yeah, and it all goes back to it all stemming from Linux, right? Linux gives you 17 ways to shoot yourself in the foot.
Yep.
And that's great until you have 12 holes in your foot and 5 things left to try.
Right. It's like my struggles with Python now. There's different libraries, different versions of it, and no one's solving my specific problem. So you got to take all those little pieces and try and put them together.
Yeah, I'm right there. I'm struggling with a little upstream project that I maintain, and I picked the wrong horse for the IP address management module.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing that like creates IP objects, IP4, IP6 stuff. I picked the wrong horse in Python 2, and now I've got to rewrite half the thing in Python 3.
Right. Yeah, we actually did one of our guys did a webcast on that, converting from Python 2 to Python 3. So
then I'll be looking for it on your website here soon, because it's looming. It's staring me down the face.
So I got a quick question, by the way. So I know we bantered about this a little bit before the show, but for our listeners, I had never actually looked into OpenShift before seeing you going to be a guest on the show, Jamie. So can you tell us what is OpenShift and how is it different from some of the other solutions out there today?
Yeah, so OpenShift is Red Hat's take on Kubernetes. Red Hat has been around since the 90s, taking open source projects and making them open source products. making them things that you can support a Sev1 outage against, making things that you can scale up to thousands of nodes, making things that are enterprise scale out of stuff that is oftentimes written by 4 guys in a basement in Denmark. And OpenShift is taking Kubernetes as sort of its beating heart, and then looking at Kubernetes and talking to customers and talking to people in the community and adding in the things that you need to take the toolbox, as Joe Beda calls it, one of Kubernetes founders, and taking this toolbox, this toolkit of things that is Kubernetes, and making it a product that you can deploy into production, that you can scale out to literally thousands of nodes, that has all of the things you need to be a production application, to be a production application platform. So it's got a nice UI. It has integrated workflows with Jenkins. It has a routing layer that just comes out of the box. It has an SDN that's configured out of the box with multiple plugins. So it takes all the things that are Kubernetes, that amazing scheduling algorithm that Google came out with, and then it adds everything that's needed on top of it to make what Red Hat considers an enterprise-grade application platform.
I agree. There's a lot more of that needs to take place as well. If you look at a lot of different open source projects, right? I'm sure you've got your list of things that you're probably eyeballing, right, to make that happen.
Yeah, and it's kind of crazy. So many people seem to you latch on to IT is latched on to Kubernetes because when you see it and it sort of first triggers that light bulb in your head, you just understand there's value there. You know it in your gut that there's value there. But a lot of people are having a hard time, 3.5 years in, getting past the part of the Kubernetes learning curve where their goal is beyond just maintaining Kubernetes. Kubernetes isn't the end state. The application sitting on top of Kubernetes is what we want to focus on in OpenShift. So you have to make those opinions. You have to take those things, like we were talking about before we started recording. You can't expose all of the nerd knobs that are in Kubernetes. There are just thousands of them. You just can't do it. No one would ever be able to get anything stood up and production ready if every single thing had to be decided on, if there were no opinions made. So we took the knowledge that's inside Red Hat, of hundreds of engineers taking thousands of customers into production for years on end, and we made those same defaults. We made those assumptions, and it's kind of crazy in that Kubernetes ecosystem. There are lots of people that focus on the laptop experience. That this stands up really, the deployment takes 13 seconds, and I can stand it up on my laptop, and I get all this great functionality, and there's value there, and I think it's awesome. And OpenShift does feel a little weird there because there's so much to it. We're running, Open vSwitch as a software-defined networking layer. We have HA proxy running as a routing layer. We have, Kubernetes. We have, multiple container runtimes now, Docker and CRIO that you can run on top of it, or as the thing that's actually running containers. And it feels a little heavy for your laptop because it's designed to run in production in your data center or in someone's data center. And that's where we care. Right. Yes, your desktop experience may be a little heavy feeling, and we have ways around that and ways to mitigate that. But our goal is to scale you up to thousands of nodes. Our goal is for you to run Pokemon Go on top of it. That huge Kubernetes success story from a couple years ago.
Right.
That's what we're aiming
at. At what point, if you're in security or application development, in your deploying applications and containers, at what point do you consider Kubernetes and or OpenShift?
Hopefully before you ever start designing the application, right? I mean,
yeah, I was going to say
right. From the get-go, right?
Yeah. About a month before you get started is when you start thinking about it. There's no easy answer there because there's so many workloads that people are trying to move into the container ecosystem. And I'm assuming, I make the assumption, and obviously I live in this weird little microcosm of Red Hat's version of IT, working with my customers, and I'm out on the front lines. I'm a pre-sales engineer, so I'm in there sort of selling the vision, selling the dream a little bit. But you have that idea of, I just assume that if you're developing a new application, or even if you're just modernizing an existing one, your goal is not only to put it in a container, but your goal is to put it in a container orchestration tool like Kubernetes. This is just the way we're going to deliver software for the next 5 to 7 years, period. And there are some edge cases that don't get painted with that brush, but they're just that. They're edge cases. The vast majority of application development these days is going into Kubernetes.
Mm-hmm.
That's just the start and stop of it.
So whether it's one application or 10,000, when you're designing that one application and you're deploying that one application, you should incorporate Kubernetes or OpenShift into that design.
Right, because when you have, like, the definition of application changed 3 years ago, right? One application used to be this thing that 5 or 10 or 500 people sat and beat on and ran through a CI/CD pipeline and took 6 hours to build and do all this stuff. Now your application is composed of all these services, and microservices is kind of a 4-letter word these days, but decomposing it down into multiple services,
right,
is the way everything is done. So your one application, the one thing your end user uses, ends up being 5, 10, 500 applications.
Mm-hmm.
And those interactions, the independent scaling needed to use your resources effectively, because Amazon ain't cheap.
Right.
When you're trying to put your application, you have to be mindful of, well, if I need to scale up my data, my middleware layer, I don't want to have to scale up my authentication mechanism, because I don't need to burn those CPU. I don't need to pay for those CPU cycles if I'm not using them. So that idea of my application consists of all of these different services that glue themselves together. Yeah, you need a thing like Kubernetes. And then even because, God, we never have enough layers of abstraction, apparently. There's even stuff like Istio laying on top of Kubernetes to give you all of this ridiculous fine-grained control of how the applications route between one another, this really intimate, really nuanced service discovery, stuff that goes way beyond my ability to comprehend as an old sysadmin. But all of that is just sort of table stakes now for application developers. And it happened in the IT world. It happened in the blink of an eye. Kubernetes isn't even 4 years old.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in my development as a programmer, right, they tell you early on in school you got to break things up into functions, and then it was objects. And now I feel like very quickly they're like, oh, by the way, now you have to break everything up into multiple containers. Like, essentially, as you were saying, Jimmy, your application is no longer broken up into functions and objects. They're really different services that provide. And I think that's a really tough thing for those of us that come from a traditional sysadmin background and programming background to really start to comprehend.
Yeah, and it's still, I even still, like, my eyes will just cross some days when I'm helping a customer dig through a really complex architecture, or a really hairy challenge that they've got to untangle and get figured out, often on a deadline. Your eyes just kind of cross. I'm like, oh my God, if we abstract any more, we're either going to find God or find a black hole.
Right.
One or the other. Like, how many times can we abstract the abstractions? Apparently at least one more is Istio's gaining traction, or the concept of Istio is gaining traction. I don't know if we can abstract beyond that. I mean, good God, I hope not, because I don't think there's any more bandwidth in my brain.
But what about, like, functions as a service running your Kubernetes containers that are running your application?
Oh my God! Now my brain really hurts.
sorry. I just.
So there is actually a thing when you really want to melt someone's brain. You start looking at, like, infrastructure tooling like OpenStack. And then you start saying, well, I can containerize the OpenStack services. So I can deploy Kubernetes, I can deploy OpenShift, and then run OpenStack inside of it to manage bare metal nodes to run containers and virtualization to deploy OpenShift. So you can get, like, we call it like hex tuple O or something. Like, you can just put all of the OpenStacks and OpenShifts on top of one another and get this ridiculous, crazy Inception-like architecture. That when you start looking at it, makes sense. But when you're first thinking about it, your eyes just cross and you just want to go hug your mom. Because it's painful to think about that we're deploying containers to deploy systems to run containers,
right,
for our end users.
Yeah, and I think it
shouldn't work. but it does.
You know, the feedback I got on my RSA talk was they liked that I had a smaller example that they could really wrap their brains around. It wasn't overly complex, right? And they were like, wow, that really helped me now when we start having those more complex conversations, like seeing it in just a smaller environment was super helpful, because there's just so many, and one thing I talk about in my talk, there's so many things you have to overcome and retrain yourself to think differently about how you're developing and deploying applications.
Yeah, and that's the drum I've been beating for a while now. You know, it gets so complex, and it's such a complete sea change of the way we've, like you said before, it's just a completely different mindset of how we've done business in the past. And it's a better way. We all just know it intrinsically.
Yep.
You know, it's more effective process isolation. It's a better experience. But it's so completely alien at the beginning that you have to just focus on that fundamental knowledge. You have to have that. Hello world has never been more important.
Right.
Learning containers.
Well, and like you said, Jamie, the benefits are just outstanding when you actually do reach that point. You know, like you said, first, there's a cost savings, right? I can only spin up containers when I need them, when I have to, right? I can have multiple containers, and I can manage and control all of that. And even for just one single application, there's a huge amount of benefit. And just deployment and recovery and like so many things. I was like, oh, this solves so many of those traditional problems, but you got to be willing to go on that journey, right? And there's a big learning curve there.
So the perfect example, and I use this for when I'm talking to customers all the time, is one of our customers, one of my particular customers. They don't have much of an ops team. They're sort of running on a shoestring budget. So they have some developers that try to stunt double. So they break their cluster occasionally, and we have to go in and help them fix it because the budgets are tight. We went in to help them fix a production cluster, and there were 607 applications running. So 607 pods in the Kubernetes speak. And a pod is roughly equivalent to a container. There can be differences, but they're essentially synonyms. So 607 containers running, representing 607 apps. 5 years ago, that was 607 VMs. Right. In a VMware cluster. 10 years ago, that was 607 pizza boxes. These people were running 607 applications on 7 AWS instances.
It's just awesome.
Yeah, it's logarithmic in your resource utilization savings.
Right.
It's just insane.
The one of the huge benefits that I saw was the ability to create different environments for different types of testing and how easy it made that, right? You go back to your pizza box model. I was and you were too, right? That sysadmin that was in there racking and stacking systems, and we need another dev environment for this, and you were racking and stacking more systems in the amount of time. Now it's just like, a couple of clicks and replicate my environment once you build it once, and now I've got a brand new environment that I can spin up for all different kinds of testing. And that the benefits there were just like, that was the biggest benefit for me, is that I can spin one up and have it automatically tested. I can spin another one up if that passes and let users test it and collect feedback. And then I can have 2 productions running, one to troubleshoot problems with and one to actually serve production customers. It's just like, I was like, that's awesome.
It's just insane. And nothing fixes bad code, right? There is no magic bullet that will fix bad code. So if you've got a Java app that takes 10 minutes to start up, it's still going to take 10 minutes. It doesn't matter. It's just your code. But we measure container spawn times in like dozens or hundreds of milliseconds. So that idea of deploying, like we do a demo at the Supercompute conference every year. This 16,000 HPC engineers get together in some place, usually in the Midwest, and just geek out for 3 or 4 days on a giant conference floor. And one of the demos we had last year was the ability, we could stand up a 25 node Apache Spark cluster. So Spark is that, the AI, ML, super analytic stuff that I don't comprehend at all. A 25 node Spark cluster in something like 4 seconds.
That's awesome.
Wow.
From nothing to 25 nodes up, UI available and ready to do work. Single digit seconds. It's just insane, man. It's a whole new world. Like, I would play golf so much more if I were still a sysadmin.
Yeah, right.
My pillow would be so much softer at night.
Well, it's funny you say that, Jimmy. I even said, I think in my talk, my last 2 talks, that like I was a sysadmin and I loved that saying, like, I'll replace you with a small shell script, right? Because I wanted to automate as much of my job as possible.
Yeah. Please let me be lazy. Yeah, I aspired to laziness
right?
When I had 1,000 servers to manage. Yeah, every day.
So I know we have a few more minutes. Two things that I wanted to make sure we touched on is I was at, as I was sharing kind of before the show, this weekend I was at the Northeast Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition, and actually one of the systems that the students had to manage was a Docker system, and so that was kind of newfangled for a lot of them, even though Docker's fairly old by tech standards. So first, I guess, are there any learning resources that you would recommend people go and take a look at, purchase, watch, what have you, to start picking up both Docker and or Kubernetes as just a technology for them to start exploring?
Yeah, I mean, is this where I can shamelessly plug my own book?
It absolutely is.
Absolutely.
Yes, it
Sure.
is.
Yeah, OpenShift in Action. No, although we did try to focus on that from the get-go. Like when you put together a tech book, one of the first things you decide is who's your minimally qualified reader. And we decided that we wanted to take a tech professional with 1 to 2 years experience. And so essentially the ability to write simple bash and spin up a VM, and we're going to teach you anything beyond that. So it goes all the way down to the bottom of the Linux kernel about what a container is, what it does, how it does what it does. So it actually is a pretty good teaching resource. And I spent a lot of very sleepless nights trying to put all that together. So there's sort of the fundamental knowledge that you're kind of talking about. And to be completely honest, the Docker docs are really good. The Kubernetes docs, there is a tutorials section that is really, really solid. The problem is, and like we were talking about this beforehand, there are something like 168, last time I counted, Kubernetes distributions out there. So 168 different vendors that will sell you Kubernetes, or sell you their take on Kubernetes. And all of them are going to be sometimes subtly and sometimes wildly different. So just kind of focusing on that fundamental knowledge of what does Kubernetes do well, what's it designed to do. The Kubernetes docs are amazing. They're not going to help you build out a 50-node cluster and run hundreds of applications on top of it.
Right.
They're just not designed to do that. So for that fundamental knowledge, the Docker docs are great, even though I actually haven't run the Docker container runtime in probably 8 months. Their documentation is really good if you're just coming to the forefront. Kubernetes is the Kubernetes website. The upstream stuff is really good. And then once you decide on a vendor, one of the things, and I tell customers to be completely open about this when they're thinking about it, anytime, when you do decide on sort of a flavor of Kubernetes, one of your selection criteria has to be how good are the docs, because they're going to be making assumptions. There are not only are there 168 vendors of Kubernetes out there, but then there are dozens upon dozens of vendors that just focus on the software-defined networking that's inside Kubernetes. And when you start sort of decision treeing all that out, it gets really complex really quickly. So focusing on the fundamentals, and then once you do decide the partner you're going to dance with, just before you even get engaged, make sure that they have training available, make sure that they have, support that's going to back you up when you need it, all of the fun stuff, all of the essentially, and it's just kind of burned into my brain at this point, essentially the Red Hat value proposition at that point. Just making sure that, when you do break it and you don't know how you've broken it, you have somebody to talk to who does know, can take you all the way down to the bottom of the kernel and all the way back up. Because when we're talking about containers, one of the key things to remember is, this is technology that's been around a long time, put together in a new way, but we are very, very much talking about low-level stuff inside the Linux kernel that makes a container contain. So you can't, we abstract it way up, but when it gets down to the rubber meeting the road, and why does my container's file system only see the stuff that I tell it to? Why does, how can I have 50 port 80s on a single host? We're talking about very low level, down in the weeds, Linuxy stuff. And making sure you understand that, and making sure your vendor can back you up when it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. To me is when I see people fail, it's because they've made some poor life choices on that front, or just had bad luck.
That's a good way of putting it. So before we let you go, are you ready for Application Security Weekly's 5 questions?
Oh God, they're questions. Yes, do it.
These are kind of rapid fire, and I think you'll find
Are
them.
you ready for my answers?
Yeah. I've never had anyone ask me that before.
Yeah.
So,
think of me anywhere.
Question 0 is, what were the specs like on your first computer?
My first computer was a 286 that my mom drug home from work. I think she paid $50 for it. And if I remember right, it had 256K of RAM. I could put a floppy in and play poker. That was about all it could do.
Nice.
Yeah.
So question 1 is, what programming language did you learn first, and what do you enjoy writing in today?
So I was a history major, right? Like I wasn't joking about that. I was really a history major for my short college career. The first programming language outside of just stuff in high school where they said, here's the little green turtle, tell him to move 10 to the left and over. The first thing I picked up in college when I decided that computers were interesting was Ada. So like the CS 101 was in Ada. I don't remember a single command in it, but that was the first one. These days, I'm very much a Python fanboy. And Go, which is sort of the language of containers and Kubernetes, is just different enough from C to really make me mad. It's kind of like listening to a French person speak Spanish. The accent is just a little off, and it's just enough to be confusing. So I'm a Python fanboy.
It's funny because I'm actually learning Go right now, and I kind of love it for the reasons that it doesn't make me do memory allocation, but it lets me still have pointers. So,
that is awesome. I'm not. Go is awesome. It's really hard for me. It's not designed for my brain.
I gotcha. So the next question, we pull you into the holy wars of computer science. Vim or Emacs?
I don't have enough knuckles in my fingers to use Emacs. My vimrc is 450 lines long.
There you go. And then, of course, the next important question, especially since you use Python, is spaces or tabs?
So last year or year before last at a conference that we throw in DC, the T-shirt, when you got there, you could actually select you were team tab or team space. And I am 100% team space. That right tab on. Crap is just, I don't understand how you look at yourself in the mirror.
And the last question, you've already kind of touched upon this, but what sort of advice do you have for newcomers to the industry?
Being someone that kind of came through the non-traditional career path, I wasn't a CS major. I don't have a college degree. I got started at an ISP help desk 1,000 years ago at a little crappy phone company in Richmond, Virginia. First and foremost, focus on the fundamentals. If you can be the person that can explain to the DBA what the developer's intent is, you're always going to find a job. And number 2, be a doer. Don't worry about looking busy, worry about being busy. Generate work, generate artifacts. I don't care if it's crap, generate stuff. That stuff could solve, I don't care if it's automating your checkbook or automating data obfuscation for vendor data reports. I don't care what it is. Be a doer and generate things. That's the only way you're going to get better at it. And it's the only way people are going to recognize your potential.
Right on. I love it. Well, with that, Jamie Duncan, thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thanks for the time, fellas. This was fun.
Thanks so much, Jamie.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
Y'all
Jamie.
have a good one.
You too.
With that, we are going to take a short break and then come back for the news.